The morning sun cast long shadows across the African savanna as Casey, a powerful lioness, stood at the edge of her territory. Her golden coat rippled with muscle beneath the early light, and her amber eyes scanned the horizon with the intensity of a predator who had never known defeat. At 8 years old, she was in her prime, ruling over a territory that stretched for miles across the grasslands. But today something was different. Today, she felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever before. Behind her, hidden in the tall grass near a cluster of acacia trees, 3 small cubs played quietly. Jabari, the eldest at 6 months, was already showing signs of the fierce independence that ran in their bloodline. His 2 younger sisters, Amara and Django, tumbled over each other in mock battles, their tiny roars barely audible above the morning breeze. They had no idea that their mother was about to make a decision that would change their lives forever. The drought had been merciless this season. The watering holes had dried up one by one, forcing prey animals to migrate further and further from Casey's territory. For 3 days she had returned from hunting trips empty-handed. Watching her cubs grow thinner and weaker, their playful energy was fading, replaced by the lethargy that comes with hunger. As their mother, Casey knew she had to act decisively. She had caught the scent 2 days ago, carried on the wind from the eastern grasslands. It was the smell of a large herd of wildebeest, probably numbering in the hundreds. They were moving slowly, grazing as they went, still several miles away from her current position. The problem was the distance. To reach them, hunt successfully, and return would take at least 2 full days, possibly 3. In all her years as a mother, Casey had never left her cubs alone for so long. The lioness turned back toward her cubs, watching as Jabari attempted to pounce on a butterfly. His coordination was still clumsy, his timing off by several seconds. Amara had found an interesting rock and was batting at it with her tiny paws, while Django had curled up in a small patch of shade, already exhausted from the morning's activities. They were so vulnerable, so dependent on her protection, yet they were also slowly starving. Casey made her way back to the cubs, settling down among them with a soft rumble. Jabari immediately climbed onto her back, his small claws gripping her fur as he tried to maintain his balance. The lioness closed her eyes and breathed in their scent, memorizing every detail. She thought about the dangers that lurked in their territory. Hyenas roamed in packs, always looking for easy prey. Leopards were solitary but deadly, capable of snatching a cub in seconds. Even other lions, particularly nomadic males looking to establish their own territory, posed a constant threat. But the greatest danger of all was starvation. Casey could feel her own strength waning. Her last successful hunt had been over a week ago, a small antelope that had provided barely enough meat for 1 meal. Her milk was drying up, and the cubs were already beginning the transition to solid food. If she didn't find substantial prey soon, they would all perish anyway. As the day progressed, Casey made her preparations. She led her cubs to the most secure location she knew, a rocky outcropping surrounded by dense thorn bush. The natural barriers would make it difficult for predators to approach undetected, and the elevation would give the cubs a good view of their surroundings. She spent hours reinforcing their temporary den, dragging additional branches and stones to create better coverage. The lioness taught her cubs a series of signals that afternoon. A low rumble meant danger was approaching and they should hide immediately. A sharp bark meant they should climb to the highest rocks and stay completely silent. She made them practice these commands over and over, until their responses became automatic. Jabari, being the oldest, seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation. His playful demeanor shifted to one of alertness and responsibility. As evening approached, Casey's anxiety grew. She paced around the perimeter of their shelter, marking her scent on every available surface. The smell would serve as a warning to other predators that this territory was claimed, though she knew it would only deter them for so long. She also cached what little water she could find in small depressions in the rocks, hoping it would last until her return. The cubs sensed their mother's distress. They clustered around her legs, mewing softly and seeking comfort. Amara, usually the most independent of the 3, refused to leave Casey's side. Django, the smallest, seemed to understand that something significant was about to happen. Even Jabari, despite his growing maturity, pressed close to his mother with unusual neediness. That night, Casey barely slept. She remained alert, listening to every sound in the darkness. The distant whooping of hyenas echoed across the savanna, and she heard the territorial roars of other lions from far-off prides. Each sound reminded her of the dangers her cubs would face alone. She licked each of them thoroughly, covering them with her scent as additional protection. When dawn broke on the second day, Casey knew she could wait no longer. The scent of the wildebeest herd was growing stronger, but they were still moving. If she delayed any longer, they might pass beyond her reach entirely. She gathered her cubs one final time, grooming each of them carefully and rumbling softly in their ears. To any observer, it might have looked like a typical morning routine, but Casey was saying goodbye. Jabari seemed to sense what was coming. As his mother began to move toward the edge of their shelter, he followed, his small body trembling with confusion and fear. Casey turned and gave him a firm but gentle nudge back toward his sisters, accompanying it with the signal they had practiced for staying put. The young cub's eyes met hers, and in that moment she saw a flicker of understanding that broke her heart. With one last look at her 3 cubs, Casey bounded away from the rocky outcropping. She forced herself not to look back, knowing that seeing their confused and frightened faces would make her lose her resolve. The hunt ahead would require all of her focus and strength. There was no room for the doubt that was already gnawing at her heart. As she disappeared into the tall grass, the lioness carried with her the desperate hope that she was making the right choice, and the terrible knowledge that she might never see her cubs alive again. The 3 cubs huddled together in their rocky shelter as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Jabari stood at the edge of their hiding place, his small nose twitching as he tried to catch any trace of his mother's scent. The familiar smell was already fading, replaced by the harsh odors of dust and dry vegetation. Amara and Django pressed close behind him, their golden fur trembling despite the growing heat of the day. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The cubs had never been alone for more than a few minutes, and the absence of their mother's protective presence felt overwhelming. Every sound made them freeze with terror. When a ground squirrel scurried past their shelter, all 3 cubs scrambled to the highest rocks, remembering their mother's training. They remained motionless for nearly an hour before Jabari finally deemed it safe to come down. By midday, hunger began to gnaw at their small bellies. They had grown accustomed to nursing regularly, and their mother's absence meant no relief from the growing discomfort. Jabari, driven by instinct and responsibility as the eldest, began to search their immediate area for anything edible. He found a few insects and some dried berries, but his inexperienced palate rejected most of what he discovered. The cubs were too young to hunt effectively, too small to bring down even the smallest prey. As the afternoon wore on, a new danger presented itself. The distant sound of whooping and chattering echoed across the savannah, growing steadily closer. Hyenas. Jabari recognized the sound from his mother's warnings and immediately gave the danger signal. The 3 cubs pressed themselves into the deepest crevice of their rocky shelter, their hearts pounding so loudly they were certain every predator in the area could hear them. The clan of spotted hyenas numbered nearly a dozen, led by a massive matriarch whose battle scars told the story of countless conflicts. They moved through the territory with the confidence of opportunists, their powerful jaws capable of crushing bones that even lions would struggle with. Their keen noses had detected something interesting in the area, and they were methodically investigating every potential source of food. The lead hyena paused just 50 yards from the cub's hiding place, her head raised as she tested the air. Cassie's scent markers were still strong, but there was something else, something smaller and more vulnerable. The hyena's lips pulled back in a grin that revealed her formidable teeth. She had found the scent of cubs that seemed to be alone and unprotected. Jabari watched in terror as the hyenas began to circle their shelter. He could see their spotted forms moving between the rocks, hear their excited chattering as they confirmed what their noses had told them. The young lion cub pressed his sisters deeper into their hiding place, using his own body to shield them from view. Every instinct told him to run, but his mother's training held firm. Stay hidden, stay silent, wait for the danger to pass. The hyenas spent what felt like hours searching the area around the rocky outcropping. They were persistent and methodical, checking every possible hiding place with the patience of experienced hunters. Several times individual hyenas came within feet of discovering the cub's location. Once, a smaller female actually poked her head into a crevice just above where the cubs were hiding, her yellow eyes scanning the darkness below. But the thorn bush barriers that Casey had so carefully constructed served their purpose. The hyenas could smell the cubs but couldn't pinpoint their exact location. The rocky terrain made it difficult to approach from multiple angles, and the thick vegetation created a maze of false trails and dead ends. After several frustrating hours, the clan began to lose interest. There were easier meals to be found elsewhere in the vast savanna. As the sun began to set, the hyenas finally moved on, their disappointed chatter fading into the distance. The cubs remained frozen in their hiding place for another hour, too terrified to move even after the immediate danger had passed. Only when complete darkness fell did Jabari finally allow his sisters to emerge from their cramped refuge. The first night alone was a nightmare of strange sounds and imagined threats. Every rustle of grass sounded like approaching predators. The distant roar of lions from other territories made the cubs whimper with longing for their mother's protection. They took turns standing watch, though their young eyes could barely penetrate the darkness beyond their shelter. When dawn finally broke, the cubs were exhausted and even hungrier than before. Jabari's attempts to find food had been largely unsuccessful, and the stress of constant vigilance was taking its toll on all three of them. Amara, usually the most energetic of the siblings, lay listlessly in the shade, conserving what little energy she had left. Django had developed a persistent cough that worried his older brother. The second day brought new challenges. A territorial dispute erupted between two rival lion prides in the distance, their roars echoing across the savanna like thunder. The sound was both comforting and terrifying to the cubs. It reminded them of their mother's strength, but also highlighted how alone and vulnerable they were in a world full of apex predators. Jabari made a crucial discovery that afternoon. While exploring a narrow crevice in their rocky shelter, he found a small pool of water that had collected from a recent brief shower. The water was precious, and he carefully rationed it between his sisters and himself. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stave off dehydration for another day or two. As the second night approached, the cubs faced a terrible realization. Their mother had been gone for 2 full days, longer than she had ever left them before. Doubt began to creep into Jabari's young mind. What if something had happened to her? What if she was never coming back? The thought was too terrible to contemplate, but it lurked at the edges of his consciousness like a shadow. The cubs' situation grew more desperate with each passing hour. Their small bodies were burning through their limited energy reserves, and their ability to remain alert and vigilant was deteriorating. They took greater risks in their search for food, venturing further from their shelter despite the dangers that lurked in every shadow. It was during one of these foraging expeditions that Django made a discovery that would change everything. While investigating a cluster of rocks about 100 yards from their main shelter, the smallest cub stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. Partially buried in the sand and hidden behind a large boulder was a collection of strange objects that gleamed dully in the afternoon sun. The items were unlike anything the cubs had ever seen. There were curved pieces of what looked like stone but felt different, harder and colder to the touch. Some pieces were flat and broad, others long and narrow. They were arranged in a rough pattern, as if they had once been assembled into a larger structure. The objects bore strange markings and designs that meant nothing to the young lions, but there was something about them that commanded attention. Jabari approached cautiously, every sense alert for danger. The objects carried no scent of any animal he recognized, yet there was something unsettling about them. They looked artificial, created rather than natural, though by what creature he couldn't imagine. As he sniffed at the nearest piece, he noticed that some of the objects were connected by what appeared to be leather straps, now dried and cracked with age. What the cubs had discovered were the remnants of ancient armor, pieces of metal and leather that had once protected a human warrior. The artifacts had been buried here for decades, perhaps centuries, slowly revealed by erosion and the shifting sands. To the cubs, they were simply mysterious objects that might provide some form of protection or shelter. As the third day of their mother's absence began, the cubs made a decision that would prove far more significant than they could possibly understand. They began to drag the strange objects back to their shelter, instinctively arranging them in ways that felt protective and secure. They had no way of knowing that they were donning the armor of an ancient predator, one who had once ruled this land with weapons and cunning rather than claws and teeth. The 3 cubs huddled together in their rocky shelter as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Jabari stood at the edge of their hiding place, his small nose twitching as he tried to catch any trace of his mother's scent. The familiar smell was already fading, replaced by the harsh odors of dust and dry vegetation. Amara and Django pressed close behind him, their golden fur trembling despite the growing heat of the day. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The cubs had never been alone for more than a few minutes, and the absence of their mother's protective presence felt overwhelming. Every sound made them freeze with terror. When a ground squirrel scurried past their shelter, all three cubs scrambled to the highest rocks, remembering their mother's training. They remained motionless for nearly an hour before Jabari finally deemed it safe to come down. By midday, hunger began to gnaw at their small bellies. They had grown accustomed to nursing regularly, and their mother's absence meant no relief from the growing discomfort. Jabari, driven by instinct and responsibility as the eldest, began to search their immediate area for anything edible. He found a few insects and some dried berries, but his inexperienced palate rejected most of what he discovered. The cubs were too young to hunt effectively, too small to bring down even the smallest prey. As the afternoon wore on, a new danger presented itself. The distant sound of whooping and chattering echoed across the savannah, growing steadily closer. Hyenas. Jabari recognized the sound from his mother's warnings and immediately gave the danger signal. The three cubs pressed themselves into the deepest crevice of their rocky shelter, their hearts pounding so loudly, they were certain every predator in the area could hear them. The clan of spotted hyenas numbered nearly a dozen, led by a massive matriarch whose battle scars told the story of countless conflicts. They moved through the territory with the confidence of opportunists, their powerful jaws capable of crushing bones that even lions would struggle with. Their keen noses had detected something interesting in the area, and they were methodically investigating every potential source of food. The lead hyena paused just 50 yards from the cub's hiding place, her head raised as she tested the air. Kessie's scent markers were still strong, but there was something else, something smaller and more vulnerable. The hyena's lips pulled back in a grin that revealed her formidable teeth. She had found the scent of cubs that seemed to be alone and unprotected. Jabari watched in terror as the hyenas began to circle their shelter. He could see their spotted forms moving between the rocks, hear their excited chattering as they confirmed what their noses had told them. The young lion cub pressed his sisters deeper into their hiding place, using his own body to shield them from view. Every instinct told him to run, but his mother's training held firm. Stay hidden, stay silent, wait for the danger to pass. The hyenas spent what felt like hours searching the area around the rocky outcropping. They were persistent and methodical, checking every possible hiding place with the patience of experienced hunters. Several times individual hyenas came within feet of discovering the cub's location. Once, a smaller female actually poked her head into a crevice just above where the cubs were hiding, her yellow eyes scanning the darkness below. But the thornbush barriers that Casey had so carefully constructed served their purpose. The hyenas could smell the cubs but couldn't pinpoint their exact location. The rocky terrain made it difficult to approach from multiple angles, and the thick vegetation created a maze of false trails and dead ends. After several frustrating hours, the clan began to lose interest. There were easier meals to be found elsewhere in the vast savannah. As the sun began to set, the hyenas finally moved on, their disappointed chatter fading into the distance. The cubs remained frozen in their hiding place for another hour, too terrified to move even after the immediate danger had passed. Only when complete darkness fell did Jabari finally allow his sisters to emerge from their cramped refuge. The first night alone was a nightmare of strange sounds and imagined threats. Every rustle of grass sounded like approaching predators. The distant roar of lions from other territories made the cubs whimper with longing for their mother's protection. They took turns standing watch, though their young eyes could barely penetrate the darkness beyond their shelter. When dawn finally broke, the cubs were exhausted and even hungrier than before. Jabari's attempts to find food had been largely unsuccessful, and the stress of constant vigilance was taking its toll on all three of them. Amara, usually the most energetic of the siblings, lay listlessly in the shade, conserving what little energy she had left. Django had developed a persistent cough that worried his older brother. The second day brought new challenges. A territorial dispute erupted between two rival lion prides in the distance, their roars echoing across the savannah like thunder. The sound was both comforting and terrifying to the cubs. It reminded them of their mother's strength, but also highlighted how alone and vulnerable they were in a world full of apex predators. Jabari made a crucial discovery that afternoon. While exploring a narrow crevice in their rocky shelter, he found a small pool of water that had collected from a recent brief shower. The water was precious, and he carefully rationed it between his sisters and himself. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stave off dehydration for another day or two. As the second night approached, the cubs faced a terrible realization. Their mother had been gone for 2 full days, longer than she had ever left them before. Doubt began to creep into Jabari's young mind. What if something had happened to her? What if she was never coming back? The thought was too terrible to contemplate, but it lurked at the edges of his consciousness like a shadow. The cubs' situation grew more desperate with each passing hour. Their small bodies were burning through their limited energy reserves, and their ability to remain alert and vigilant was deteriorating. They took greater risks in their search for food, venturing further from their shelter despite the dangers that lurked in every shadow. It was during one of these foraging expeditions that Django made a discovery that would change everything. While investigating a cluster of rocks about 100 yards from their main shelter, the smallest cub stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. Partially buried in the sand and hidden behind a large boulder was a collection of strange objects that gleamed dully in the afternoon sun. The items were unlike anything the cubs had ever seen. There were curved pieces of what looked like stone but felt different, harder and colder to the touch. Some pieces were flat and broad, others long and narrow. They were arranged in a rough pattern, as if they had once been assembled into a larger structure. The objects bore strange markings and designs that meant nothing to the young lions, but there was something about them that commanded attention. Jabari approached cautiously, every sense alert for danger. The objects carried no scent of any animal he recognized, yet there was something unsettling about them. They looked artificial, created rather than natural, though by what creature he couldn't imagine. As he sniffed at the nearest piece, he noticed that some of the objects were connected by what appeared to be leather straps, now dried and cracked with age. What the cubs had discovered were the remnants of ancient armor, pieces of metal and leather that had once protected a human warrior. The artifacts had been buried here for decades, perhaps centuries, slowly revealed by erosion and the shifting sands. To the cubs, they were simply mysterious objects that might provide some form of protection or shelter. As the third day of their mother's absence began, the cubs made a decision that would prove far more significant than they could possibly understand. They began to drag the strange objects back to their shelter, instinctively arranging them in ways that felt protective and secure. They had no way of knowing that they were donning the armor of an ancient predator, one who had once ruled this land with weapons and cunning rather than claws and teeth. The news of Casey's successful hunt had spread through the wildebeest herd like wildfire, but the lioness was too focused on her prize to notice their distant alarm calls. She had managed to bring down a young bull that would provide enough meat to sustain her and her cubs for several days. However, the kill site was over 40 miles from her territory, and she faced the daunting task of either transporting the meat or consuming enough to justify the long journey home. Casey chose a combination approach. She gorged herself on the fresh meat until her belly was distended and uncomfortable, storing as much nutrition as possible for the journey ahead. Then she began the laborious process of tearing off strips of meat that she could carry. Lions weren't naturally equipped for long-distance food transport, but maternal desperation drove her to attempt what seemed impossible. The journey home became an epic of endurance and determination. Casey traveled primarily at night to avoid the heat and reduce the risk of losing her precious cargo to scavengers. She cached portions of meat along the route, carefully hiding them in locations she could remember and return to if necessary. The weight of the meat strips in her jaws made running difficult, and she was forced to maintain a steady trot that was both exhausting and painfully slow. By the third day of her return journey, Casey was beginning to have disturbing dreams during her brief rest periods. She dreamed of returning to find her shelter empty, her cubs taken by predators or dead from starvation. She dreamed of arriving too late, of finding only small bones scattered around the rocky outcropping. These nightmares drove her to push harder than her body could reasonably handle, forcing her to continue even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Meanwhile, the cubs had become local celebrities of sorts. Word of their strange appearance and successful defense against the leopard had spread throughout the animal community. A family of warthogs reported seeing spirits of ancient hunters walking among the rocks. A troop of baboons claimed to have witnessed lion cubs who had eaten the spirits of metal beasts and taken on their power. The psychological impact of these stories was beginning to affect not just the cubs, but the entire local ecosystem. Predators who might normally have investigated the area around the rocky outcropping were giving it a wide berth. Prey animals spoke in hushed tones about the strange transformation that had occurred in their midst. Even the vultures, typically fearless in their pursuit of carrion, avoided flying too close to the cubs' territory. Jabari had emerged as the clear leader of his small group. The breastplate he wore had somehow enhanced his natural charisma and confidence, making him appear larger and more authoritative than his actual age would suggest. He had begun to develop hunting strategies that incorporated the psychological advantages of their armored appearance. When hunting insects or small rodents, he would position his sisters to create maximum visual impact, using their intimidating appearance to freeze prey with confusion and fear. Amara had discovered that her helmet made her roars sound deeper and more resonant. She practiced different vocalizations for hours, developing a repertoire of sounds that could serve various purposes in communication and intimidation. The metal amplified and modified her voice in ways that made her sound like a much larger and more dangerous predator. She took particular pleasure in the startled reactions of other animals when she demonstrated her new vocal abilities. Django, despite being the smallest of the three, had perhaps benefited most from the transformation. His collection of smaller armor pieces gave him an appearance of being covered in protective scales, like some mythical creature from ancient legends. He had learned to move in ways that made the metal pieces catch and reflect light, creating an almost hypnotic visual effect that could distract and confuse potential threats. The cubs had also developed new social dynamics within their group. The shared experience of wearing the armor had created a sense of unity and purpose that went beyond their natural sibling bonds. They moved together like a coordinated unit, each understanding their role in maintaining the group's intimidating presence. They had even developed a series of signals using the metal pieces, creating sounds by striking different parts of their armor to communicate silently with each other. On the 6th day of their mother's absence, the cubs faced a new challenge that would test all of their newfound abilities. A clan of spotted hyenas, different from the group that had threatened them earlier, had caught wind of the strange stories circulating about the rocky outcropping. These hyenas were led by an older, more experienced matriarch who was skeptical of supernatural explanations for unusual prey behavior. The matriarch had decided to investigate personally, bringing with her a group of 6 other hyenas to explore the area thoroughly. Unlike the previous clan, these hyenas were not easily deterred by scent markers or unusual appearances. They were hungry, determined, and experienced enough to distinguish between real threats and psychological tricks. The hyenas approached the cubs' territory just after dawn, when the morning light would give them the best visibility for their investigation. They moved in a coordinated fashion, spreading out to cover all possible escape routes while maintaining visual contact with each other. The matriarch led from the front, her scarred muzzle and confident gait testament to decades of successful hunting. Jabari spotted the approaching threat while standing watch at the edge of their shelter. The sight of 7 hyenas moving with obvious predatory intent sent a chill through his small body, but the weight of his armor reminded him that he was no longer the helpless cub he had been a week ago. He quickly alerted his sisters using their new signal system, the metallic tapping sounds carrying clearly in the morning air. The 3 cubs took their positions at the entrance to their shelter, presenting a united front against the approaching predators. They had learned from their encounter with the leopard that confidence and coordination were their greatest weapons. Jabari stood in the center, his breastplate gleaming in the morning sun and the carved lion head seeming to snarl defiance at their enemies. Amara and Django flanked him, their own armor creating an impressive display of strength and unity. The lead hyena paused when she caught sight of the cubs, her experienced eyes taking in every detail of their unusual appearance. She had heard the stories, but seeing the reality was still startling. These were clearly lion cubs, probably no more than 6 or 7 months old, but they wore what appeared to be the protective shells of some unknown creature. More importantly, they showed no signs of fear or submission despite being vastly outnumbered. The matriarch began to circle the cubs' position, testing their resolve and looking for signs of weakness. She had encountered young lions before, and they invariably broke and ran when faced with overwhelming odds. But these cubs held their ground, turning to track her movement and maintaining their defensive formation with a discipline that seemed far beyond their apparent age. Jabari chose that moment to demonstrate the full power of his new identity. He stepped forward, his small body made imposing by the ancient armor, and released a roar that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. The metal breastplate amplified and modified the sound, creating harmonics and overtones that made it seem like the voice of some primordial predator. Amara and Django immediately joined in, their own armored voices adding layers of complexity to the intimidating chorus. The effect on the hyenas was immediate and dramatic. Several of the younger members of the clan actually took steps backward, their ears flattened against their heads in surprise and uncertainty. Even the experienced matriarch paused, her confident advance faltering as she tried to process what she was hearing. The sounds coming from these small cubs didn't match anything in her extensive experience with lion vocalizations, but the psychological impact went beyond just the modified roars. The cubs' bearing, their coordinated movement, and their obvious lack of fear created a cognitive dissonance in the hyenas' minds. Everything about the situation suggested easy prey, but the reality they were observing told a completely different story. The ancient armor had transformed not just the cubs' appearance, but their entire presence and identity. The standoff between the armored cubs and the hyena clan stretched for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The matriarch continued her slow circle around the rocky outcropping, but her confidence was clearly shaken. She had built her reputation on reading situations accurately and making quick decisions based on reliable information. This situation defied all of her experience and instincts. The other hyenas looked to their leader for guidance, but she seemed as uncertain as they were. The cubs maintained their defensive formation, moving in perfect coordination to keep facing the primary threat. Their armor caught and reflected the morning sunlight, creating flashes of brilliance that added to their intimidating appearance. More importantly, they showed no signs of the fear or panic that the hyenas expected from young prey animals. Jabari understood instinctively that this was a crucial moment. The hyenas were hesitating, but they hadn't retreated. He needed to tip the balance decisively in favor of the cubs. Drawing on the confidence that the ancient breastplate had given him, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Instead of maintaining a defensive position, he began to advance toward the lead hyena. The sight of a 6-month-old lion cub actually approaching a full-grown hyena was so unprecedented that it momentarily stunned the entire clan. Jabari moved with the steady, purposeful gait of a predator rather than prey, his armor making him appear larger and more formidable with each step. The carved lion head on his breastplate seemed to come alive in the shifting light, its eternal snarl appearing to grow more fierce and threatening. Amara and Django immediately understood their brother's strategy and moved to support him. They spread out slightly, creating a wider front that made their small force appear larger and more coordinated. Their own armor pieces reflected light in different patterns, creating a dazzling display that was both beautiful and intimidating. The 3 cubs had become something that transcended their natural species, embodying the spirit of ancient warriors who had once ruled this land. The psychological pressure on the hyenas was becoming unbearable. Everything they knew about predator-prey relationships was being challenged by these impossible cubs. Young lions simply didn't behave this way. They didn't advance confidently toward superior numbers. They didn't wear mysterious protective shells. They didn't roar with voices that seemed to come from beyond the natural world. The breaking point came when Django, the smallest of the cubs, made a move that was both brilliant and terrifying in its implications. He deliberately struck 2 pieces of his armor together, creating a sharp metallic ringing sound that echoed off the rocks around them. The noise was unlike anything that occurred naturally in the African savanna, and its artificial quality suggested the presence of some unknown and potentially dangerous force. That single metallic note was enough to shatter the hyena's resolve completely. The matriarch, faced with a situation that challenged everything she understood about the natural order, made the only decision that seemed rational. She barked a quick retreat command to her clan, and the 7 hyenas melted away into the grassland as quickly as they had appeared, their disappointed chatter fading into the distance. The cubs watched their enemies disappear with a mixture of triumph and disbelief. They had faced down a full clan of spotted hyenas, one of the most dangerous predator groups in Africa, and emerged victorious without suffering so much as a scratch. The ancient armor had given them not just physical protection, but a psychological advantage that seemed almost supernatural in its effectiveness. As the immediate threat faded, the cubs began to understand the full implications of what they had accomplished. They were no longer just three vulnerable lion cubs hiding in the rocks and hoping their mother would return. They had become something new, something that commanded respect and fear from the most dangerous predators in their environment. The transformation was so complete that they barely remembered what it felt like to be helpless and afraid. Word of their victory over the hyena clan spread through the animal community like wildfire. A secretary bird who had witnessed the encounter from a nearby tree carried the news to every creature within miles. The story grew with each telling, until the cubs had become legendary figures who possessed the power to drive away entire packs of predators with nothing more than their presence and their mysterious metallic shells. The psychological impact rippled throughout the local ecosystem. Predators began to avoid the area around the rocky outcropping entirely, unwilling to risk an encounter with whatever force had transformed three ordinary cubs into creatures of legend. Prey animals spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the metal spirits who had taken residence in their midst. Even the scavengers, typically fearless in their pursuit of carrion, gave the cubs' territory a wide berth. Meanwhile, Casey was entering the final stretch of her journey home. She had been traveling for over a week, covering ground that would have taken her 2 days under normal circumstances. The weight of the meat she carried and her own exhaustion had slowed her progress to a crawl, but her determination never wavered. She could taste her territory in the air now, could smell the familiar scents that meant home and safety. The lioness had lost considerable weight during her extended absence, burning through her own body fat to maintain the energy needed for the long journey. Her ribs were beginning to show beneath her golden coat, and her movements had taken on the careful, measured quality of an animal, operating at the limits of its endurance. But she pressed on, driven by maternal instinct and the desperate hope that she would find her cubs alive and well. As she crested a low ridge that overlooked her territory, Cassie paused to scan the landscape for any signs of her cubs. The rocky outcropping where she had left them was still there, looking exactly as she remembered. But something was different. There were no other predators in the immediate area, which was unusual for such a prime piece of territory. The entire region seemed strangely quiet and empty, as if some unseen force was keeping other animals at bay. The lioness began her final approach cautiously, every sense alert for signs of danger or tragedy. She had prepared herself for the worst during the long journey home, but she had also held on to hope that her cubs' natural intelligence and the secure shelter she had provided would be enough to keep them safe. Now, as she drew closer to the moment of truth, her anxiety reached almost unbearable levels. The cubs, meanwhile, had detected their mother's scent on the wind long before she came into view. The familiar smell triggered an explosion of joy and relief that threatened to overwhelm their newfound confidence and discipline. They wanted nothing more than to run to her, to feel her reassuring presence and know that their ordeal of independence was finally over. But something held them back, some instinctive understanding that they were no longer the same cubs she had left behind. Jabari took the lead in managing their reunion, understanding that their transformation needed to be revealed carefully and gradually. He positioned his sisters so that their armor would be clearly visible, but not immediately threatening, creating a display that would announce their change while avoiding any appearance of aggression toward their returning mother. The ancient breastplate he wore seemed to pulse with inner light, the carved lion head appearing almost alive in the afternoon sun. As Casey rounded the final bend that would bring her cubs into view, she was preparing herself for whatever she might find. In her worst nightmares, she would discover only empty rocks and scattered bones. In her best hopes, she would find 3 hungry but healthy cubs who had somehow managed to survive on their own. What she actually found was something that her imagination could never have prepared her for, something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her own offspring and the natural order of their world. Casey froze in complete shock as her cubs came into view. For several heartbeats, she couldn't process what she was seeing. 3 small figures stood at the entrance to their shelter, but they bore little resemblance to the vulnerable cubs she had left behind a week ago. Each of them wore strange, gleaming coverings that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. They stood with a confidence and authority that seemed impossible for animals their age. The lioness blinked hard, wondering if exhaustion and stress were causing her to hallucinate. But the vision remained constant. Her cubs were not only alive, they had somehow transformed into something that defied her understanding of the natural world. The strange metallic coverings they wore gave them an imposing presence that made them appear larger and more formidable than their actual size. More disturbing still was their bearing, which suggested strength and confidence rather than the relief and desperation she had expected. Jabari stepped forward first, his movement careful and measured. The ancient breastplate he wore caught the sunlight and seemed to pulse with inner fire, the carved lion head appearing to come alive with each step. His small body had adapted completely to the weight and bulk of the armor, and he moved with a grace that incorporated the metal pieces into his natural feline agility. When he looked at his mother, his eyes held a depth and wisdom that hadn't been there when she left. Amara and Django flanked their brother, their own armored forms creating an impressive display of unity and purpose. The helmet that Amara wore transformed her head into something that looked almost regal, while Django's collection of smaller pieces gave him the appearance of being covered in protective scales. Together, the three cubs presented a sight that was both magnificent and deeply unsettling to their mother's eyes. Cassie approached slowly, her nose working to confirm that these were indeed her offspring beneath the strange coverings. Their scent was familiar but changed, overlaid with the odors of metal and ancient leather that spoke of mysteries beyond her comprehension. She rumbled softly, a questioning sound that asked for recognition and explanation without demanding immediate answers. The cubs responded to their mother's call with obvious joy, but their reaction was tempered by an awareness of how much they had changed. They moved toward her with the same coordinated precision they had developed during their week of independence, their armor creating a symphony of subtle metallic sounds that accompanied their approach. When they reached her, they pressed close in the traditional greeting of their species, but even this familiar gesture felt different now. As Cassie nuzzled each of her cubs in turn, she began to understand the magnitude of their transformation. The armor they wore was not simply decorative, it was functional protection that had somehow enhanced their natural abilities and confidence. She could feel the solid weight of the metal pieces, could sense the way they had become integrated into her cubs' movement and behavior. Whatever had happened during her absence had fundamentally changed not just their appearance but their very identity. The reunion was both joyful and strange. Cassie was overwhelmed with relief to find her cubs not only alive but apparently thriving. The meat she had brought would provide sustenance for several days, ensuring that their immediate survival needs were met. But the mystery of their transformation created a new set of questions and concerns that she was utterly unprepared to address. Jabari seemed to understand his mother's confusion and began to demonstrate what they had learned during their week alone. He led her to the small cache of water he had discovered, showed her the improved defensive positions they had created around their shelter, and explained through body language and simple vocalizations how they had successfully defended their territory against multiple threats. Each demonstration revealed new levels of competence and sophistication that should have been impossible for cubs their age. As the afternoon progressed, Cassie began to piece together the story of her cubs' transformation. She found the site where they had discovered the ancient armor, noting the way the remaining pieces were arranged and the obvious signs that her cubs had carefully selected and modified their protective gear. She observed their enhanced hunting techniques, their improved communication methods, and their obvious psychological advantages in dealing with potential threats. The most striking change was in their social dynamics. Where she had left 3 individual cubs who related to each other primarily as siblings, she had returned to find a coordinated unit that functioned with almost military precision. They had developed specialized roles within their group, created new forms of communication, and established a hierarchy of leadership that enhanced their collective effectiveness. The transformation was so complete that Casey began to wonder if these were truly the same cubs she had given birth to. As evening approached, the family settled into their shelter for the night. Casey shared the meat she had brought, watching in amazement as her cubs consumed their portions with an efficiency and maturity that spoke of hard-won survival skills. They had learned to ration resources, to eat quickly when threatened, and to appreciate every meal as a precious gift rather than an automatic entitlement. The cubs took turns standing watch throughout the night, a behavior they had never exhibited before their mother's departure. They moved through their guard rotations with practiced ease, their armor allowing them to remain alert and intimidating even in the darkness. Casey found herself feeling like a guest in what had once been her own territory, watching her offspring manage security and logistics with capabilities that surpassed her own. During the quiet hours before dawn, Casey reflected on the profound changes that a single week had wrought. She had left to save her cubs from starvation, and had returned to find that they had saved themselves in ways she could never have imagined. The ancient armor had given them more than physical protection. It had unlocked potential that she hadn't known existed within them. They were still her cubs, still young and in need of guidance, but they were also something new and unprecedented. The lioness began to understand that their family dynamic would never be the same. Her cubs had tasted independence and power, had proven themselves capable of surviving and thriving in the face of overwhelming odds. They would still need her wisdom and experience, but they would never again be the helpless dependents she had once protected. The armor had transformed them into partners in their own survival, allies who could contribute as much as they required. As dawn broke over the savannah, Cassie made a decision that would shape the future of their pride. Instead of trying to remove the armor or return her cubs to their previous state of dependence, she would embrace their transformation and help them develop their new abilities even further. She would learn from them as much as she taught them, creating a new model of family structure that incorporated the lessons they had learned during their week of independence. The cubs sensed their mother's acceptance and approval, and their relief was visible in every movement. They had feared that she might not understand or approve of their transformation, that she might try to force them back into the vulnerable roles they had previously occupied. Instead, she was embracing their evolution and preparing to support their continued development as the unique creatures they had become. The ancient armor had created more than just 3 protected cubs. It had forged the foundation of a new kind of pride, one that combined the natural instincts and abilities of lions with the tactical advantages and psychological impact of human technology. The cubs had become living bridges between the prehistoric and the modern, embodying the potential for cooperation between species that had never before been possible. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, mother and cubs began to plan their future together. They would need to establish new territories that could accommodate their enhanced abilities and reputation. They would need to develop hunting strategies that took advantage of their psychological advantages, while maintaining the stealth and coordination that made lions such effective predators. Most importantly, they would need to decide how to use their unprecedented status in the animal kingdom to ensure not just their own survival, but their evolution into something even greater. 6 months later, the legend of the armored pride had spread across the entire African continent. What had begun as whispered stories among local wildlife had evolved into epic tales that were carried by migrating herds, migratory birds, and traveling predators to every corner of the savannah and beyond. The 3 cubs who had once huddled in fear while their mother hunted had become the most famous lions in Africa, and their influence was reshaping the very nature of predator-prey relationships across the ecosystem. Cassie had fully embraced her role as the mother and mentor of these extraordinary cubs. She had learned to incorporate their armored abilities into traditional hunting strategies, creating new techniques that were both devastatingly effective and psychologically overwhelming to their prey. The pride now hunted as a coordinated unit that combined the stealth and power of natural predators with the tactical advantages of armored warriors. Their success rate had increased dramatically, and they had never again faced the specter of starvation that had once threatened their survival. Jabari had grown into his role as the leader of his generation, his natural charisma enhanced by the authority that the ancient breastplate continued to provide. At over a year old now, he was approaching the size where the armor fit him perfectly, as if it had been crafted specifically for his adult form. The carved lion head on his chest piece had become his signature, and other animals could identify him from great distances by the way sunlight reflected off the metal. He had developed into a master strategist, capable of planning complex hunts that took advantage of both natural lion behavior and the psychological impact of their armored appearance. Amara had discovered that her talent for vocal modification had applications far beyond intimidation. She had learned to create sounds that could communicate across vast distances, allowing the pride to coordinate activities over territories that would have been impossible to manage, using traditional lion communication methods. Her helmet had become more than just protection. It was a tool that amplified her natural intelligence and allowed her to serve as the pride's long-distance communication specialist. She could mimic the calls of other species so perfectly that she had begun using deception as a hunting tool, luring prey into traps by imitating the sounds of their own kind. Django, despite being the smallest of the siblings, had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation. His collection of armor pieces had taught him to move with a fluidity and grace that was almost supernatural to observe. He had become the pride's scout and reconnaissance specialist, capable of approaching potential prey or threats with a stealth that surpassed even traditional lion abilities. His scaled appearance allowed him to blend with rocky terrain in ways that made him nearly invisible, and he had developed the ability to gather intelligence about their environment that gave the pride significant tactical advantages. The psychological impact of the armored pride extended far beyond their immediate territory. Other predator groups had begun to modify their own behavior in response to the stories they heard about these legendary lions. Some had become more aggressive, trying to prove that they could match the reputation of the armored cubs. Others had become more cautious, avoiding areas where they might encounter these mysterious creatures. The entire predator-prey balance of the region had shifted in response to the existence of lions who seemed to transcend the normal limitations of their species. The cubs had also begun to attract attention from other lions, though not always in positive ways. Some prides viewed them as abominations, unnatural creatures who violated the traditional order of lion society. Others saw them as potential allies or leaders who could help them achieve their own territorial ambitions. A few older lions had begun to seek them out specifically, drawn by curiosity about the ancient armor and the possibility of learning new hunting techniques. One such encounter had occurred just weeks after Casey's return, when a massive male lion appeared at the edge of their territory. This was no ordinary male looking to establish dominance or claim females for his own pride. He was ancient by lion standards, his mane gray with age and his body bearing the scars of countless battles. But his eyes held an intelligence and purpose that suggested he had come seeking knowledge rather than conflict. The old male had approached their territory openly, making no attempt at stealth or aggression. He had settled down at a respectful distance from their shelter and waited, demonstrating patience that suggested he understood the significance of what he was requesting. When Jabari finally approached to investigate, the ancient lion had spoken in the complex vocalizations that older lions used for serious communication between prides. What the old lion revealed changed everything. The cubs thought they knew about their armor and its origins. He told them stories that had been passed down through generations of lions, tales of the time when humans had shared the African landscape with the great predators. He spoke of ancient alliances between lion prides and human warriors, partnerships that had allowed both species to dominate territories that neither could have claimed alone. The armor that the cubs wore, he explained, was not just protective gear. It was a symbol of that lost cooperation between species. According to the old lion stories, there had once been human warriors who rode into battle alongside lion companions, sharing territory and prey in relationships that transcended the normal boundaries between predator and prey. These alliances had been destroyed by changes in human society and the expansion of settlements that pushed lions into increasingly isolated territories. The armor that Jabari, Amara, and Django had discovered was a relic of that ancient partnership, a remnant of a time when cooperation between species had created legendary warriors who ruled vast territories through combined strength and intelligence. The revelation had profound implications for the cubs' understanding of their own identity and purpose. They were not just lions who had found mysterious protection. They were the inheritors of an ancient legacy that connected them to a lost chapter of African history. The armor had chosen them in a sense, recognizing in them the potential to revive the partnership between human intelligence and lion strength that had once made their ancestors legendary. This knowledge transformed their approach to their territory and their relationships with other species. They began to see themselves not just as successful predators, but as bridges between different forms of intelligence and capability. They started experimenting with cooperation rather than just domination, finding ways to work with other species that benefited everyone involved rather than simply establishing themselves at the top of the food chain. The cubs also began to understand that their transformation was still ongoing. The armor continued to change them in subtle ways, enhancing not just their physical capabilities but their intelligence and wisdom. They found themselves capable of strategic thinking that went far beyond traditional lion planning, able to consider long-term consequences and complex relationships that would have been impossible for them to grasp before their transformation. As their second year of life began, Jabari, Amara, and Django had evolved into something that transcended traditional species classifications. They were lions, but they were also something more, carriers of ancient wisdom and modern adaptation that made them uniquely suited to thrive in a changing world. Their mother watched their continued evolution with pride and wonder, understanding that she had played a role in creating something that would influence the African ecosystem for generations to come. The Armored Pride had become more than just a successful hunting group. They had become a symbol of adaptation and evolution that inspired changes throughout their environment. Other animals began to experiment with cooperation and innovation, influenced by the example of lions who had successfully integrated foreign elements into their natural abilities. The cubs had proven that survival and success didn't require abandoning one's essential nature, but rather finding ways to enhance and evolve that nature through wisdom, courage, and the willingness to embrace change. Their story had become a legend that would be told around the African continent for generations, a tale of cubs who were left alone and discovered that they carried within themselves the potential for greatness that transcended the limitations of their birth. They had become the alpha predators their mother had always known they could be, but in ways that exceeded even her most ambitious dreams for their future.